Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar featuring Jay Weatherill, former South Australian Premier and now Chief Executive of the Thrive by 5 initiative of Minderoo, and also featuring Penny Dakin, the CEO of Ecec. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. First of all, let me apologise if people have logged in early. I'm sorry for the way the webinar was showing on the system. It's actually the first one I've set up, and if that's caused confusion, I do apologise. Now, for those attending, as shown on the side, the right-hand side, you'll see a little panel. It's the GoToWebinar app, and if you click on the orange arrow button, you can open and close the app to either get it out of the way or access its features. The small white triangles on various panes or panels in this app let you collapse or reveal different controls. The audio pane lets you choose how to listen to the webinar and test your audio settings. So if you have any issues with audio during the webinar, you can switch, for example, from the default of computer audio to instead listen by phone using a dial-in number and PIN. Microphones are muted during the session, but you can ask questions by using the questions pane. We'll get to your questions later on in the Q&A session, probably at 20 to the hour or perhaps quarter to the hour, just depending on how we're going. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available free of charge soon on the Ecec website. Keep an eye on our weekly e-bulletin for that, and you can subscribe for that on our website. I'll now hand over to Penny Dakin. So Penny, if you can unmute yourself, and we'll begin. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining us for our webinar today. I want to begin by acknowledging that wherever we are meeting on the lands of Australia's traditional custodians. For me, that's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and to elders emerging. I also want to acknowledge the ongoing contribution that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play in the life of the city that I live in and the community that I'm a part of. And that's a great contribution, and we are a great city as a result of those contributions. I also want to acknowledge that this week is Anti-Poverty Week, which is obviously an issue that we've been advocating really strongly here at Ecec. Poverty is the #1 issue impacting Australia's children and young people. And if you can get behind any of the activities and support Anti-Poverty Week in any way, that would be most appreciated. We're going to run today's webinar with Jay Weatherill in what we'd like to call a fireside chat sort of method. We're going to do a bit of a question and answer session. Thanks for joining me, Jay. It's great to have you on board again and to be talking with you about early years reform and about the work of Thrive by 5. Before we start, I'm going to read a quick bio. Not that you need a lot of introduction, but I think it's important to acknowledge just the breadth of experience that you have brought to your role at Minderoo. So as Paul indicated, you are former South Australian Premier and that you have been the CEO at the Minderoo Foundation since early this year. Prior to that, you were the 45th Premier of South Australia, leading a Labor government in the state from October 2011 to March 2018. You're probably exhausted. You are currently an ambassador for the International Children's Education Organisation, Reggio Emilia. You're working with us on the Great 8 research agenda. You are an industry professor at the University of Adelaide, and you have a family. How do you have time to do all of that?
Managed just to sneak in a little bit of running around the banks of the Swan River as well, which is looking very lovely today.
That's fantastic. I started with this question last time you and I caught up, Jay, and I think it's a really, really important question, especially given that amazing background that you have. I didn't talk about the fact that you're a lawyer and you've led a law firm and all of those sort of things. But after all of that time leading a government in South Australia, what is it that made you decide that this was your next thing? Like, why invest yourself in this now?
Well, I should begin by saying I'm coming to you from Whadjuk country here in Perth. But I suppose it really, for me, it all started back in 2004 when I first started on working in children's portfolios. So I was Minister for Child Protection, and really from that point onwards, I was in one way or another involved in portfolios that concern children. So whether it was child protection or early childhood development or education, Aboriginal affairs. And what struck me, partly along that period, we also had a thinker in residence called Fraser Mustard, who was from Canada, and he came out and talked to us about the neuroscience of the way in which a child's brain develops in the first 3 years in particular, but of course over those first 5 to 8 years. And once you've heard that, once you've heard how a child's brain develops in those first 5 years and how profound that is for their future trajectory in terms of health, learning and behaviour and their opportunities, you know, their relationships, their well-being, it's impossible not to unknow that. And then the more you look into it, all the things that I got into politics to actually address, all the questions of social justice and disadvantage and inequity, you could sort of see that you could trace back their origins to the first 5 years and the way in which the experiences that children had in those first 5 years. And so, you know, one of the things I suppose if you've had a relatively long career in politics, one of the things that you do get a bit frustrated about is that the pace of change isn't as fast as you might hope. And so your mind tends to go, well, what can make the most difference? What am I going to be able to say to my grandkids when I stop working and start and say, what have I done? So for me, you know, I feel like, you know, as my working life sort of starts to come towards the end, you know, or hopefully not anytime soon, but you know, I'm certainly in the back end of my career, I start to think about what's going to make the most difference, and it's got to be the first 5 years. And so that's why I was so thrilled when I got offered this job. I thought, well, this is almost the perfect job to try and shift the dial on early childhood. So that's why I'm doing it.
Thanks, that's awesome. And I'm sure resonates, you know, with pretty much everybody on today's webinar. So with that in mind, tell us about Thrive by 5. What is it? And, you know, tell us about the broad coalition you're building.
Yeah, so it's a campaign. It's a campaign essentially to put early childhood on the national political agenda. That's, you know, in its essence. Because it's based on the idea that all of the big levers in this early childhood space really sit with government. I mean, obviously there's a critical role for parents, but even that is influenced by the way in which the sort of information and support that you can wrap around parents. And so what we need to do is motivate those various systems that involve themselves in the life of families and children in the first 5 years, so that they're better, that they're more coherent, they're more integrated, that the gaps that exist at the moment are met, and that we bring the high quality service and the information that we know and put them in the hands of parents. So Fraser Mustard, this man I talked about earlier, who wrote a fantastic report for us back in 2008 about neuroscience of child's brain development. The byline for the report is closing the gap between what we know and what we do. And there is a massive gap between what we know and how we behave. Like if you believe what we now know about the way in which a child's brain development, how on earth can we permit them to exist in neglectful situations or in stressful situations, or parents that are struggling, and or parents that simply have never been shown how to parent themselves because of the impoverished experiences they have? How can we permit that? And so if you want to do something about that, you've got to motivate government. If you want to motivate government, you've got to create pressure for change. I mean, governments have so many things on their agenda, you know, climate change, COVID crisis, unemployment. There's no natural reason why early childhood should be on the national political agenda. And so our campaign fundamentally is about creating the pressure for change to actually put it on that agenda. And I can talk about how we're going to do that, but that's the fundamental analysis about why we're doing this.
Yep, fantastic. Many of the people who are on the webinar today would have seen the open letter that went into a number of newspapers, a month or so now, and I've seen the sort of the focus of the ask, initial ask anyway, around early childhood education and care. Why start there? I mean, what's your thinking about that being the logical first place?
Well, as people on this call know, the early childhood development system is not a system at all. It's a series of subsystems that occur at Commonwealth and state level. And so, I mean, this is a simplification to make the point, but there's at least 5 service systems. There's the childcare system that we've just talked about. There's the preschool system. There's infant and maternal health system. There's the child protection system. And then there's probably a thing you could broadly describe as a family and community services system. So all of those systems don't really connect very well with one another. There are some connections, but they're not really integrated in any fundamental way. Many of them are at different levels of government. Certainly they're at different agencies. And even within those agencies, they're not the main concern of that agency. So infant and maternal health is in an agency that is dominated by concerns about public hospitals. Childcare is in a federal agency which is principally concerned with workforce participation and really probably has its eyes on schools and universities more than it does on childcare. And child protection has got many concerns, not nearly the concerns of the birth to 5 section, and is an overwhelmed service system that's dealing with so many challenges in at-risk families. So what we've got is we haven't got a coherent system, and so why choose childcare? Well, in a sense, if you think about the life course and the connection between these service systems and families. So the baby is born, and obviously the infant and maternal health system is prominent, and everybody has a touch point there for a short period of time. Then really the state disappears pretty much until 4-year-olds with preschool. And the bit in the middle is really the childcare bit, which people have quite a long association with. Many families, not all, have quite a significant relationship over an extended period. Now, childcare is by no means universal, and many of the families would most benefit from high quality early learning don't get access to it because it really is constructed as an incident of employment policy rather than part of a systematic early childhood development system. So it is, in a sense, a bit of a hole in the donut, if you like, of trying to actually create an integrated system. This bit between the infant maternal health system and the preschool system is sort of missing a different level of government, different imperatives. And if we're going to build out a coherent system, we really first have to fix this bit in terms of quality, in terms of accessibility, in terms of affordability. And as it happens, politically, it also is one of the service systems that has demonstrated how precarious it is throughout the COVID crisis. So what we've seen is this system has fallen over during COVID, as it did 10 years ago with the ABC learning collapse. So it's a precarious service system. It stands in contrast, a stark contrast with, say, the education system or the health system, which have by and large stood up during the course of this crisis. So it's a topical issue, and so it creates the opportunity for us to put early childhood on the agenda by focusing our initial attention on childcare. It's not, of course, the whole game, but it's a critical. It's in a sense the arrowhead for our ability to build a broad coalition of support around a campaign for early childhood development reform.
That's fantastic, and what I love about that is the fact that you're talking about a broad coalition and a whole system that wraps around a child and their family from the time, that their first 1,000 days through to when they interact with the formal education system. given that, and given the I guess the nature of the campaign that you're creating, tell me a little bit about your sort of immediate response to last week's budget.
Yeah, well, obviously, I suppose the starting point for our campaign is the analysis that the sector, as broadly described, maybe those 5 service systems, is not strong enough on its own to win this campaign. I mean, we've been putting, and the truth is, we've been putting these high quality arguments in front of decision makers for years. I can remember working with you, Penny, when you were back in the Commonwealth Public Service, and we were trying to put this issue on the national agenda about a decade ago. And I had a crack at it in COAG by trying to put this on the national agenda, and it gets there for a while, but it slips away because there's no ballast and there's no imperative for governments to focus on this. So the thinking is the sector is necessary but not sufficient. And our arguments, our high quality arguments about investing in the early years have always been great arguments. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. So what do we need to do to get the political process to act? Well, we need to build a coalition. And the coalition needs to bring in parents, working families that are finding the current system not supportive of them and their lives, educators, of course, and the broader practitioners in the early childhood development space, but also trying to build the broadest possible coalition in civil society. And one of the opportunities that's opened up is that the current system of childcare, early learning, really disadvantages women in a pretty fundamental way. And there is a real opportunity to build a coalition with women who feel disadvantaged by the way in which the current system works, to actually build that very broad coalition for change to bring pressure on the political process. And what was interesting is that COVID, which has had a disproportionately bad effect on women, really opened up almost a natural sense in which there should be a response in the federal budget. And the Commonwealth, you could sense that because they put out a women's economic security statement. But it was largely derided as a bit of an afterthought, a sort of a relatively poorly funded statement that even they didn't have much confidence in because it was sort of hidden away and not really promoted. And one of the other things that most people thought would be responded to in the budget was this crisis in childcare, which has been revealed. And once again, nothing in the budget. So what that has done is open up this critique of the federal budget that it wasn't sufficiently supportive of women, which in turn opened the door for federal Labor opposition to step into that space. And so the federal Labor opposition has received some positive plaudits for their response, where they did step down the path of reform of early learning, and correspondingly the government's received some criticism. So, and I suppose the critically important thing for me is that we had a national political leader in Anthony Albanese for the first time in my memory saying things like, that 90% of a child's brain is sort of developed in the first 5 years, which is a really powerful statement of some of the things that we're trying to actually communicate. And essentially what's happened is that early childhood is now on the national political agenda. There's a long way to go, and there's by no means, we're by no means even at the first phase of achieving what we hope to achieve, but at least we're in the public discourse. And it's been a long time since that's happened.
Yeah, look, one of the title of our budget actually was our pre-election document. The lead up to the last election here at Ecec was they don't vote, but they do matter, which is sort of, I think, tends to be how many issues to do with children and young people are viewed. That these are issues that are only important because of the fact that their parents vote. They're not important in their own right, because the children themselves don't vote. For me, one of the things that I really liked about the budget reply speech was the framing and the language. I think the opposition leader spoke in a language and framing of investment and opportunity in relation to early childhood education and care, and in relation to growing a society of individuals who are empowered and supported and grown through these investments. And I think that, if, as you say, if we've managed to get early childhood development on the agenda in a way that we've never done before, I'm excited that may be the way we're able to frame it, not just as in costs, and not just for workforce participation, although there are staggering benefits in regard to that. And I think some of the modelling that we've seen speaks to that, but also the fact that this is actually a positive system, or systems, well-connected systems of early childhood development are actually good for kids now too. Is that sort of your thinking as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a frustration in a sense. What you need to say to motivate certain sections of the community is not necessarily all the things that are important about why we need to invest in the early years. And I know that there are frustrations with many people when they hear the case for change being articulated in terms of economic benefit without looking at the intrinsic benefits for children and their healthy, happy development and the full citizenship that investing in the early years unlocks. I know that that's certainly how I see the issue. And I mean, I suppose one of the most inspiring things I saw was when I got involved in this organisation, Reggio Emilia, and the way in which they characterise the investment in the early years. And the way they characterise the investment in the early years is to think of really that they seek to reimagine the vision of children in society. So instead of children being seen as weak subjects with needs, they characterise them as powerful citizens with rights. And this is a big paradigm shift about how we look at children as sort of lacking, that we have somebody we have to fill up. They see children as complete and just full of possibility. And this is, I think this is such a powerful idea for democracy, the idea that each person is complete and just full of unique possibility, to create with others their own meaning and knowledge and fully participate in the life of society. I just find this one of the most empowering ideas. And of course, not everybody is excited about it as I am. So, the truth is we have to frame the arguments to try and build the coalition. There's a sort of there's a set of arguments that motivate conservatives, and there's a set of arguments that motivate progressives. And there's a way in which we can have all of that so that we get to a really high level of support for this agenda. Conservatives are concerned about the cost of late intervention. So you can win arguments with conservative people with conservative perspective and say we're wasting a lot of money on the current system because we're trying to fix up problems that would have been much better invested in the early years. I think conservatives are also interested in creating citizens with the skills and capacities to participate in the businesses that are necessary to drive our economy. That's those skills and capabilities are laid down in the early years. And also conservatives also like the idea of buttressing the family and the family as a critically important sort of unit of organisation in civil society. On the other side, and these are sort of simplistic labels to make the point, but on the other side, progressives are more interested in the equity question. So investing in the early years is so crucial to solving disadvantage. And also, progressives are also interested in the way in which this interacts with the public education system, and the way that this can become almost a new part of the social insurance project to actually build out the early years system as a counterpart to the public schooling system. So there's something in this for everyone. We're able to attract a very broad coalition of support by the way in which we construct our arguments. And then there's a sort of almost an overarching factor, and that's the way which sort of covers both progressives and conservatives, and that's women. I mean, unambiguously, this system discriminates against women. 90% of women, second income earners are women, and it punishes you if you want to work more than part-time, which throws up one of the highest rates of part-time employment in the world. and that constrains women's choices about career. They look at their superannuation accounts at the end of their career and they realise that they're much lower than the corresponding blokes. You know, this is a big gender issue, and it motivates women across all generations. So, you know, there's a lot of good arguments here. I mean, this is a winning campaign if we can get these arguments in the hands of people.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that was one of the things that really struck me from your launch event a few months ago now, was the really broad and eclectic group of people you had pulled together to speak on that night. I mean, I think you had everyone from Julie Bishop through to Kate Carnell. You know, it was a very interesting group of people who I don't think you could necessarily, you know, describe as being of one political persuasion or another. It was a group of people who really saw the inherent value of this outside of politics, or outside of partisanism, maybe it's a better way to frame it.
Yeah, we paid a lot of attention to trying to, you know, build a unifying coalition. Obviously, everybody knows I come from the left of politics, so it was crucially important that we had conservative voices. Obviously, we also wanted to cover off somebody that could speak really across the whole of the sector. So when we were, one of the reasons why that the open letter was penned by with Fiona Stanley was that she's such a highly regarded campaigner and thinker in this area of early childhood across a whole range of domains, the ones that I discussed, not just the health sector that she comes from, but really all these very different domains. And it was really important that we had somebody that could warrant the importance of this campaign, because look, a lot of people will think to themselves, you know, why are we sort of backing a campaign of this sort? And I suppose what we're trying to do is it's not our campaign, it's your campaign. We're trying to actually give a voice to everybody that's ever worked in this sector and cares about little children. And we're trying to, you know, round everybody up. There are many voices, but we want one message. And that's how we'll be powerful. That's how we'll win this thing. As if we can, I mean, there are lots of detail that sits beneath this idea of a universal high quality early learning system. I mean, there's so much detail embedded beneath that would take an hour to unpack. But we do need to communicate succinctly so that people can say, yes, I'll buy that, I'll support that, I'll get in behind that campaign. And that's what we were trying to do, to at least talk about lots of other things, but at least talk about this when we're talking to people and try and persuade them, so that we can build the necessary supporter base, so that we start to put pressure on the politicians, and then they start to react.
One of the questions that you asked us at the National Early Years Summit back in March, which for me feels like about 10 years ago, but apparently is only about 8 months ago, and I've actually heard you ask it in other contexts before, is what's your 100%? And so I'm going to ask you, what's your 100% for this campaign? What does 100% look like?
Integrated early learning system, which delivers universally accessible, high quality learning, wraparound services, all those areas I talked about, health, learning, specialist support for those children that have got particular difficulties or challenges, might be trauma, might be learning difficulties, might be disabilities, allied health, all of those wraparound services. Connected to the education system, ideally co-located on school sites, but in some way connected with the education system. So there was a line of sight to an accountable agency. High quality, making sure that the people, the practitioners, are properly remunerated, properly trained, respected, given secure employment, so that they can build, you know, deep, long-standing relationships with the children that come into these places. And finally, place-based, like it has to be contextual. It has to look like the place and be relevant to the community. This is critically important and Aboriginal communities, but really anywhere. I mean, every place has its own culture and dynamics, and the needs of every community will be different. But so that we think they're the characteristics of a great system. How we get from where we are now to there, we're doing a lot of careful thinking about, and we're working with a range of very clever people who are helping us to think through those things. But they're the characteristics, I think, of a great system.
Fantastic. So I guess then that leads us to, so where's the campaign at now, and what are your next steps?
Well, behind me, there we go. Join the campaign at thriveby5.org.au. I'd be very grateful if you went to that website and clicked on. The more supporters we have, the more we can drive the campaign. So you go there and you'll get basically a campaign supported journey. Tells you what's going on, what we're hoping to do next. At the moment, we had the launch, as you mentioned, on the 1st of September, and when we've really started a roadshow, which will go around the whole country. But of course, we started in Western Australia because we're not allowed out. So we've been to Broome, we've been to Karratha, we're off to Kalgoorlie, Perth, of course, and then down to Albany. So we're sort of doing quite a bit in Western Australia between now and Christmas. Hopefully, after Christmas, we'll be able to get out and about and cover the rest of the nation. Although one thing we have discovered is that the power of these processes, being able to reach many people quite conveniently through online forums. So what we're hoping is that we'll have a little campaign operation in every section of the country, and we can then use that to recruit more supporters, and then ultimately put pressure on the political process to make sure that they know that they can't ignore these questions.
So you've mentioned getting onto the website and signing up and becoming a campaign supporter. What else? Yeah. I mean, we've got a couple of hundred people listening this afternoon. Yeah. What else can that constituency do to get behind this? Content.
We need stories that drive. I mean, the first phase of our campaign is, why do we need to change the system? What's wrong with the current system? So what we need are stories which essentially enable us to understand where the gaps are in the current system. The more of those we have, the more that we can talk about them, the more we can create the case for change. And real life case studies are incredibly powerful, because as people talk about their experiences, others come forward and say, yeah, that's happened to me. That's my experience too. How can I get involved to change this? It's really interesting when you put a stake in the ground, Penny, and you say, here's a problem, and I'm campaigning to change it. It's remarkable who comes out. What you find typically in these sectors is there are a lot of people that work really hard, relatively poor wages. They're pretty exhausted, and the idea of them spending time campaigning, isn't that attractive, because they think, well, is it really going to get anywhere? Am I wasting my time? That's what a lot of people in this sector think. I've tried this before, nothing ever happens. Is this just another one of those things? And I truly believe that the circumstances that we're in at the moment, a whole lot of things have come together to make me believe, at least, that this campaign has real prospects of success. So I think your time, your effort, your volunteer effort to be involved in this campaign will mean something. And the more voices we can raise, the more supporters that we can drive to the website, the more powerful this will be.
So if people are interested in penning a case study or chatting with somebody, yes, just put a call through your Thrive by 5 website.
Absolutely. And it may be that, there are different ways you can contribute. Obviously is to round up other people and try and talk about this issue amongst other people, to try and share this information. And we encourage people to do that in the organisations within which they work. But there's an inside track, which is a sort of policy work we're doing behind the scenes to really work on this complex question of design. Because the system I've described is very easy to say, but very hard to operationalise, talking about different levels of government, different agencies all working collaboratively. And then of course the third thing is the public thing. if people are interested in speaking publicly, writing something publicly, just raising their voice. I mean, we have to talk ourselves into existence. The way we do that is by raising our voices. And, you know, lots of other people are out there competing for attention for their causes. We have to raise our voices. And you know, if somebody wants to speak on camera, on radio, or in print, we'd love to hear from you, and you know, we encourage you to do that.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, I think that's certainly a message that I know is going to resonate with a whole heap of people who are online. One of the things that you know, in all of this, I think is really important, and you know, we've been talking about internally at Racy for a while now, and I know it's something that you guys in the campaign have been thinking about, is that, you know, one of the challenges we face is in recognising the importance of the voice of children and young people themselves in these conversations. And yet, you know, these kids in the under fives, we often as a sector struggle to think of ways of incorporating children's voice. It's certainly not impossible. It's, you know, sometimes it's a little bit challenging. And I know for people who are at the Early Years Summit, you know, we produced the little video that we ran at the start of both days of the summit, which was, you know, our you know, go at that time around, you know, making sure we had those voices represented. Is it something that you guys have been thinking about, that children's voice perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really powerful to watch little children in those first 5 years, that the way in which they think through and reason about issues, and their process of discovery. It really is a miraculous time of life. And the more we're actually able to sort of watch and observe that, the more I think it's highly motivating for people to you know, for the adults that we really need to press into action to actually become active. So, you know, I think the more we can produce, the more we can show, you know, this brain building in action, and because that's actually what's happening. It's happening before our very eyes. It is a miracle. But realise that it doesn't happen accidentally or by itself. It happens through the product of high quality experiences, and often practitioners are the link between the science and the parents. So putting the information in the hands of parents so that they can understand it in their daily lives, in their own interactions with their children, but also to assist them to understand the imperatives of system change, I just think is so powerful. And it's such a lovely, whenever if you ever watch somebody observing a documentary concerning children, you'll see that they really lean in when they see little children at play, and just watching how they reason and how they work through and they problem solve and they interact with their peers. It's really something quite special to observe.
Yeah, couldn't I agree with you more, Jay. It's you know, such a fundamental thing. One of the things I know you and I have spoken about a bit, and I just want to put out there as well, this notion of brain building has been huge for us in 2020. And I know huge for you guys at Minderoo, and the work that you've been doing through the core story and your app, and I'll give you a minute to talk about that. But for us, I think one of the big, not discoveries, I mean, there's a whole heap of stuff. As you said, you know, Fraser Mustard's been writing about this neuroscience, brain science stuff for a long time, but really empowering and getting that knowledge into the hands of people who can use it to change their practice, to change their day-to-day interactions with children and families, and to get it into the hands of families too, so that they can, you know, really think deeply about how they parent. I think is one of the big opportunities that are arising out of work that you're doing and work that we're hoping to do through the Australian Brain Builders Alliance.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful topic. I know that you mentioned Fraser Mustard. One of his recommendations was to ensure that there's proper training for practitioners in, you know, the neuroscience for the way in which children's brains develop, not just for practitioners, but for policymakers and everybody that are involved in the lives of children in those first 5 years. As you said, the core story is an attempt, and the Bright Tomorrows campaign is an attempt to put that information in the hands of the broader community. But what we have been very keen to do is to promote our parenting app, the Bright Tomorrow's parenting app, which is just free to download on the App Store. And the whole notion of that is to support parents and caregivers, and it's based on this idea that meaningful moments build young brains. And we know that from the moment a child's born, more than 1 million neural connections are made every second when they're having these high quality experiences. And they develop the building blocks in the brain through, and these sort of moments that are just simple things are the things that develop those essential life skills, the skills that enable them to navigate their emotions, the frustrations of daily life, all of the challenges that they're going to confront, but also these are the building blocks for the skills that they're going to need to participate in the modern economy. I mean, what I find fascinating is all these process jobs are disappearing through automation. What's left are those high-level executive skills, the organisational skills, the emotional control, the ability to work with others. All those things which are laid down in those first 5 years are the jobs that are, they're the skills and the jobs that are left, because all of the routine things are being done by machines now. So it's those human functions that are so critical. So this is, and this in itself is linked to equity. I mean, if the jobs that you're preparing children for don't exist, what sort of life are we, so we're perpetuating the inequality, which we know then drives these, this takes you back to the first point you made about Poverty Week. That takes you back to the inequality, which drives poor outcomes for children. So, yeah, this is a virtuous circle. We get this right, I think we solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, indeed. And actually the link to equity sort of links us to our first, one of the things that I was really delighted, Jay, is we don't often get questions in advance of our webinars. But today we have a few. People have written in advance of hearing you speak with a couple of questions. So I might start, and the first one is about equity. So I think it's a really good link. And our question comes from Kath, and she says, the impact of the fragmentation of early years services is felt most strongly by families experiencing the most vulnerability, including those of refugee backgrounds. How do we include connection with broader services such as settlement, trauma, and mental health with the early years?
Yeah. Look, I think that the starting point is the best evidence is that universal platforms give you the best opportunity to reach every family. They also have the advantage of being non-stigmatizing. There's a bit of a common sense around the place that politically, which is a bit of a myth, I think, that somehow targeted services, because they're cheaper, are more likely to gain political support. I actually think the contrary is the case. I think it's much harder to build a rhetoric around support for disadvantage, however that might be described, than it is to support, to build a coalition of support around universal services. So I think there's a quality issue, there's a sort of a design issue, which I think universal services are quite a powerful place to reach people. Obviously, you then need to build the specialist services on top of that. But I think there's also some politics in it as well, and that I think it becomes easier to win the argument. And to flip that on its head, I've seen the way in which focus groups respond to arguments about disadvantage, and it's not attractive. That disadvantage can very easily be characterised as people making poor life choices, and that tends to be pathologized, and you tend to lose political support. Whereas I think if you're able to construct it in terms of every child needs the best possible support, and that there should be no places in this country where people are left behind, and therefore high quality services should be available to all children. I think that's a better and more powerful place to begin the conversation. So I said, look, my whole motivation is the very things that your questioner has talked about. That's what I'm interested in doing, solving the sort of injustices of people that are left behind for all those reasons, refugees, children that have suffered trauma, all of those things are my abiding concerns. But I sort of know that the way I'm going to get there is not necessarily to talk directly about them, but to talk. Sometimes you need to talk about them, but the first thing we need to do is to build a powerful coalition of support around reform.
Yep.
And then build these service systems off those universal platforms.
Yeah, I know we actually received a lot of feedback after you spoke. I think it was the end of the first day of the National Early Years Summit, and you talked about, you know, using or not using, but leveraging the door open through those universal platforms and making sure we leverage them wide enough to accommodate the needs of you know, complex families at the same time. And we certainly received a lot of feedback that really resonated with the 450 sector leaders who were there at the National Early Years Summit. I think from an ERACI perspective, one of the things that, you know, I often feel like we don't make clear enough, and we should, is that universal doesn't mean the same. There's this idea of when we say a universal service, it means the same thing for child A and as B, as C, as D, from, you know, different places and with different backgrounds. What universal means is that everyone gets it. It's not exactly the same. And so what we want to do, you know, when we apply our sort of ERACI lens on that, is we want to make sure that the services that are needed are actually available and delivered through that universal platform that you spoke about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. I will go on to our second question that we've received in anticipation. It's quite a long one, so I'm going to read it. So apologies for my reading. So this has come from Gemma, and Gemma says that she coordinates a children and families hub in Brisbane that runs a fee-free occasional care service for vulnerable families experiencing crisis, including homelessness, domestic and family violence, and mental health. She's also the chair of a Children and Families Advisory Committee, consisting of approximately 20 different services committed to improving the outcomes for children and families. And as a group, they believe in investment, that investment in affordable, flexible, accessible, trauma and attachment informed early childhood services should be a priority for state and federal governments. I think we can all agree with you there, Gemma. She then goes on to say that they've been following the Thrive by 5 campaign, among others, and while encouraged to see such strong calls for changes to the industry, are a bit concerned that the calls for reform are centred around benefits of increased workforce participation, and feel that any improvements that arise may not meet the needs of the children because of this focus. As a collective representing the disadvantaged and vulnerable children, we'd like to know how we can shift the focus of this movement to the developmental needs of children rather than the childcare needs of parents. Now, I think we've spoken to that sort of indirectly on and off throughout today, but it would be really good to, because I know that will be a concern of many people online.
Yeah, no, look, this is the big question. There are, I suppose the first thing is we want to win. Right, that's the first thing. I'm sick of losing this debate. We've been talking about this for a long time, and it's too important for us not to win. There are much better early childhood development systems around the world. We don't have a great system in this country. Let's be frank about that. And we can do a whole lot better. So I'm interested in arguments that actually are winning arguments, so that we can achieve the very things that your questioner has posed. There are 3 arguments that really do work, and we should be running all of them. Having said that, the media is not necessarily as interested in each of them as we might be. The first one is the experience-based brain development argument, the critical importance of those first 5 years and the way in which a child's brain develops, and you know, that's got a positive and negative effect. Quality experiences build the brain, negative experiences curtail its growth and all of the attendant challenges that prove very resistant to shifting later in life. So that argument is without doubt a winning argument, and it needs to be repeat it long and loud. Some people think they understand that the first 5 years are important, but when you're able to talk about it in more detail, it's highly motivating for them, not only in their own lives, but also about what should happen in the system more generally. So I agree entirely. The second big argument that really motivates people is cost of living, which is about childcare as we currently describe it, but the early learning system we would imagine in the future. And at the moment, about 27% of a average parent's income, family income, goes on childcare, which is one of the highest proportions of similar countries, and that's a really powerful disincentive for families. And indeed, it's often the families that are most vulnerable, who are not really connected to the system of world of work, who could most be supported by a proper high quality early learning system. So, you know, so grappling with the cost question is crucial, and in the way in which the activity test provides some punitive disincentives there as well, is critically important. The first argument, brain development. Second argument, cost of living. Third argument is this workforce discrimination issue against women. The particular design of the system means that many women are able to work as many days as they want, and that has a particular effect on women. Now, we know those three arguments work and they're powerful, and they serve to bring together a coalition of people together. So you might have seen quite a lot of the economic arguments and the workforce disincentive arguments. That's largely, I think, because of the present debates and the present state of the economy, and the sort of things that we think might get through to the current government, who have made the test of their economic recovery jobs, and that's why workforce participation in the economy has been front and centre. But I absolutely share the view that we can't entirely have an economic narrative. It needs to also have this developmental narrative about the way in which a child's brain develops and what that means for their future life opportunities.
And do you think that as we, I guess, as you've said, the media are particularly interested in the economic arguments, the workforce participation arguments for whatever one reason or another. Do you think as we grow this discourse and as we, continue to have this issue on the agenda in a way that we haven't had before, that we'll, be able to create a shift towards having those conversations about the best interests of, children themselves?
Absolutely. And there's a sort of an ebb and flow of a strategic communications campaign, which first you've got to, as I've described before, you've got to get, knock the door open so that you can get through. I'll give you an example. For those people that might remember the Your Rights at Work campaign around work choices, it was about a lot of things. In the particular, there was some grave concerns about individual contracts and all the rest of it. Most people couldn't understand what that meant. They didn't know whether they were an individual contract, they didn't know whether they were a collective agreement. It was a very complex technical argument. But one thing became aware, through research, became aware that there was great anxieties about changes to the unfair dismissal laws. And I don't know whether you remember the ads that were run about a woman that received a phone call from the employer that said, you've got to come in. And she said, what about my kids? And, basically it was your job or you had to leave the kids alone. That really cut through, right? Once that had cut through and people were saying, wow, this work choices legislation is really bad, tell me more. Then you were able to talk about the other elements of the legislation because they were sort of listening. Oh, okay, well, prepared, if it's got this in it, I'm prepared to actually, you see what I mean? Like there's a sort of a sequence in the way in which we need to crack open the conversation. First, you've got to put early childhood on the agenda, tick. I think we're getting there. Then you've got to start talking about some of these things. Why should we do something? Well, the system's broken. Why? Who's it broken for? And then you can start to broaden this. Oh, and by the way, it's actually really important for the way a child develops and how the child is going to be for the rest of their life. Oh, well, that's interesting. Tell me more. Like there's a sequence to these things. So look, I suppose what I'm appealing to people is don't get frustrated with the fact that there is, you know, we may not always be talking about your issue, but there is, you know, the campaign will develop and there will be opportunities to broaden this campaign out. And these voices have to be heard, because ultimately we want a system that we can't, having built this coalition, we can't then just, you know, cut people adrift. It has to meet the needs of every child, and in particular disadvantaged children.
Absolutely. I'm really conscious that we're very close to time. I'm just going to throw over quickly to Paul, back in our tech area. Do we have one question, Paul, that we might like to end with?
Well, we've had quite a few, thanks Penny and Jay, and I think though they fall into the streams of not leaving children behind, the economic versus the child benefit argument. I think you've covered those really well. But we had one that I think it's not clear, but I think it goes to the integration of maternal health and child health services and how that might link to ECEC. And I'm just wondering maybe if it's worth expanding in that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's really the $64,000 question in a way, is how do you integrate all these different service systems together in a way which is rational? And one way of thinking about it is if you have place-based services, you know, then these things can be integrated. There are some great examples of service integration already. It's not like we're working off a blank sheet of paper here. I mean, there are some great successes in the state that I'm in now, Western Australia. We have a school at Chalice that brings these things together. The government here has got child parent centres that does wonderful things. The Smith family runs some really important sort of integrated child and family centres. Doveton School in Victoria is a standout example. Logan Together does great work in Queensland. I mean, there are great examples across the nation of the way in which infant maternal services and early childhood education and care have been sort of integrated. But I think the secret sauce is community-led, community-informed, because that's the means by which you can discipline these service systems to meet the needs of the particular community. I mean, governments, one of the challenges for governments is that they sort of have to exercise some degree of horizontal equity. It's very hard for governments to do different things for different communities. You know, there is a tendency to one size fits all, and that's because they've got accountabilities that sort of drive that. So this is not simple, and this is some of the work that we're thinking about. And if people have ideas, we're very keen to talk to them about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I think that's really exciting, because for me, I think that's where the rubber hits the road, where you actually start talking about, well, you know, how do we do this differently? How do we mess up or shake up this system and rebuild it in a different way? And you know, community-led, community-driven, I think are really great lenses to put on that. I think the picking apart what actually this could look like is going to be an exciting piece of work that you've talked about as a sort of an essential part of the campaign. I'm mindful that we didn't get to a lot of questions, and what we'll do is we'll have a look through those questions, and we'll make sure anything that wasn't captured through the discussion, that either Jay or I put together a sort of a written response to those to people. That'll be made available at some point with the recording. We are at time, so I will thank you, Jay, once again for making yourself available, and your resources of Thrive by 5 for coming along. And if you are interested in contacting the campaign, Jay's web address is behind his head. Our details for Racy are on the slide that you can see. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Jay, and your team as well. Goodbye, everyone.
Cheers, thank you.
Bye, Jay.